Imagine a civilization celebrated for its architecture, law, and philosophy, the cradle of Western ideals. Now imagine that same civilization building an entire legal economy around the systematic abuse of children. This is not a dark conspiracy. This is ancient Rome. While history books exalt the Roman Empire's political might and cultural achievements, they often sidestep a brutal, institutionalized reality: the exploitation of young boys as personal property for elite pleasure. This wasn't rare, it wasn't hidden. It was legal, normalized, and in many cases proudly discussed. Among the many categories of Roman slaves, there was one especially disturbing: the concubinus, a boy purchased specifically for intimate service. These children, typically aged 10 to 16, were not servants or apprentices. They were selected, inspected, and sold solely for their physical appeal and perceived submissiveness. 12 was considered the ideal age. Their youth and virginity increased their market value significantly. The law in Rome, advanced as it was for its time, offered no protection for these boys. Freeborn citizens were shielded by the Lex Scantinia, a law passed in the 2nd century BCE meant to regulate sexual conduct. But it only applied to assaults on freeborn males. Slaves, human property, had no such rights. A slave owner could do anything to their concubinus without consequence, including resale or execution, as long as it didn't damage the boy's market value. Wealthy Romans didn't hide this practice. They talked about it in letters, in poems, at dinner parties. Writers like Pliny and Martial referenced these relationships casually, even humorously. For the elite, keeping a beautiful male concubine wasn't a secret. It was a status symbol. These boys were sold at elite slave markets alongside luxury goods and racehorses. Their value often dwarfed that of skilled laborers or household slaves. A strong farmhand might cost 2,000 sestertii. A virgin Greek boy with education and docility, up to 50,000 sestertii or more, the price of a luxury estate. But how were these children acquired? Rome's insatiable appetite was fed through war, poverty, and abduction. Military campaigns across Gaul, Germania, and Britannia routinely captured adolescent boys. Commanders would reserve the finest for themselves or sell them in bulk to dealers. Boys were marched for weeks in chains to ports like Alexandria or Ephesus. Many died on the way. Those who survived were broken, malnourished, and entirely at the mercy of Rome's most perverse appetite. Other routes were quieter, more bureaucratic. Roman law allowed creditors to seize children from families who couldn't pay debts. Some parents, destitute and desperate, sold their sons voluntarily. These contracts specified everything: age, condition, and intended use. Slave dealers ran efficient operations. Catalogs listed available boys by physical traits, experience, even temperament. Buyers could inspect them, not unlike livestock, including invasive tests to confirm virginity and obedience. Greek boys were considered the most refined and cultured, and fetched the highest prices. Germanic boys were prized for their exotic features and physical strength. Some traders specialized by region, while others worked through kidnapping rings in rural areas where disappearances were less likely to be investigated. Even transportation was cruel. Slave ships treated children like cargo. Cramped into dark holds, boys were often assaulted by crew members under the excuse that it would prepare them for future owners. Those who resisted were beaten, branded, or mutilated. But the worst wasn't the capture or the sale. The worst came after, inside the homes of Rome's most powerful citizens. Inside the grand villas of Rome, the life of a boy concubine was meticulously structured, not for his benefit, but for the convenience and pleasure of his owner. These were not makeshift arrangements, they were systems. Orchestrated routines designed to eliminate resistance and maximize availability. Concubines lived close to their masters' private quarters. Their rooms were bare, small, often shared with other boys. Privacy didn't exist, comfort was discouraged. This was by design, a daily reminder that they were not people, only property. Their value lay not only in appearance, but in their ability to perform convincingly under constant abuse. Boys were expected to smile, to entertain, to obey without hesitation. A lack of enthusiasm could be punished, not just with beatings, but with starvation, sleep deprivation, or scarring, physical marks of their supposed failure. Owners often kept multiple concubines. Within these groups, hierarchies formed. Older boys, no longer seen as desirable, might oversee younger ones, managing schedules and preparing them for service. Some clung to this structure as a coping mechanism. Others broke down entirely. Schedules were strict. Owners dictated when and how each boy was to be used, like entertainment programming. Some households assigned boys to specific days of the week. Each morning began with grooming, bathing, even rehearsals for conversation. Nothing was left to chance. Every part of the child's identity, their voice, body, reactions, was controlled. Education, when offered, wasn't for the child's benefit. It served the owner's interests. Boys were taught music, poetry, conversation, not to uplift, but to enhance their role as entertaining companions during abuse. The more refined the performance, the more valuable the slave. Psychological control was constant. Boys were forbidden from forming friendships or speaking about their treatment. Any sign of sadness was a threat to the owner's fantasy, and punished accordingly. Emotional repression became survival. Some owners branded their concubines, permanently marking them with initials or house symbols. These weren't just signs of possession, they were reminders that freedom, even if someday granted, would never erase the past. A scar on the chest or hip would follow them forever. Medical care focused only on preserving the boy's appearance and functionality. Doctors treated wounds that affected value, not pain, not trauma. If a boy was injured in a way that made him less appealing, he might be sold, abandoned, or even executed with minimal legal scrutiny. The Roman elite viewed all this as normal. Letters and writings of the time speak not in whispers, but in casual observation. In the words of one senator, the beautiful ones earn their keep with more than hands. Such statements weren't shocking. They were everyday remarks in a society that turned child abuse into routine luxury. What made it worse wasn't just the legality, it was the celebration. Boys weren't only broken physically, they were dismantled emotionally. Stripped of their names, their pasts, and any sense of control, they were reduced to objects trained to perform, and punished when they failed. Rome, for all its glory, built an empire on exploitation, and the most defenseless were its most profitable victims. Rome's appetite for male concubines required a constant supply, and its system for acquiring them was as vast as it was brutal. Every corner of the empire fed into this machine. The largest source? War. During military campaigns, Roman legions didn't just seek land or gold, they sought bodies. Adolescent boys were especially valuable. Commanders often instructed soldiers to capture them alive. The most physically appealing were reserved for officers or sent back to Rome to be sold at elite slave markets. These campaigns weren't rare raids, they were routine. In Gaul, Germania, and Britannia, entire villages were emptied of their children. Marches to slave ports could take weeks. Boys walked in chains, undernourished and terrified. Many died before reaching market. Suicide attempts were common. Escape was almost impossible. Survivors arrived weak, silent, and malleable, perfect candidates for sale. Their trauma wasn't seen as a tragedy. It was a feature, a sign they were ready to obey. Debt slavery provided another steady flow. Roman law permitted creditors to seize children to settle debts. Parents, often impoverished and desperate, sometimes offered their sons willingly. These sales were fully legal, with contracts listing physical traits, expected use, and conditions of sale. In many cases, the buyer didn't even meet the child before purchase. The slave markets operated with chilling professionalism. Buyers browsed detailed catalogs describing boys by age, origin, education, body type, and sexual experience. The most sought-after trait: virginity. It tripled the price. Greek boys fetched the highest prices. Their reputation for refinement, education, and grace made them ideal for elite households. Boys from noble Greek families, captured during uprisings, could sell for sums greater than entire estates. Germanic boys were valued for their striking looks and physicality. Age, beauty, and docility were priced with mathematical precision. And then there were the kidnappers. In rural provinces, where law enforcement was thin, child-snatching rings flourished. Professional slave hunters scoured villages for unattended boys. Disappearances were rarely investigated. The infrastructure of Rome, roads, ports, and bureaucracy, made distribution easy. A child taken in northern Hispania could be sold in Alexandria weeks later. Transportation was its own form of torment. Slave ships were packed with children in spaces designed for grain, not people. No sanitation, no privacy. Little light. Crew members routinely abused the boys during the voyage, arguing it would train them to be more obedient. Resistance was punished with violence, whippings, mutilation, or branding. The goal was simple: obedience, beauty, and fear, all preserved long enough to sell. Once at market, the inspections began. Naked boys were paraded before buyers, touched, examined, sometimes violated. Compliance was essential. A smile could raise the price. A flinch could reduce it. Dealers developed reputations for quality stock. Some specialized in educated boys. Others trafficked only war captives. Rome's wealthiest clients had preferences, age ranges, accents, skin tones, and dealers delivered accordingly. And all of it was legal. All of it was sanctioned. The buying and selling of children wasn't a hidden trade. It was an industry, organized, normalized, and grotesquely efficient. Behind the closed doors of Roman villas, the exploitation didn't end with ownership. It evolved into something colder, more systematic. Every detail of a concubine's existence was engineered to reinforce power and erase resistance. The boys were always nearby, but never fully visible, housed in cramped quarters just steps from their master's private rooms. Proximity ensured access at any hour. Some owners woke their concubines during the night for use, regardless of exhaustion or illness. Sleep wasn't a right, it was a variable in the master's schedule. These boys lived on edge. Their days were dictated not by the sun, but by demand. They were expected to prepare, physically and mentally, for encounters. Baths weren't for hygiene, but for display. Grooming was precise, skin smooth, hair styled, body posed. Hesitation, averted eyes, or fatigue could be interpreted as disrespect and punished harshly. Punishment came in many forms. Starvation was common, so were beatings. But often the most devastating discipline was psychological. Owners trained boys to display not just submission, but apparent joy. To perform pleasure during abuse, it wasn't enough to comply. They had to smile while doing it. This performance wasn't optional. A boy who failed to show willingness faced severe consequences. The cycle created a form of emotional torture. To survive, they had to erase themselves. Some boys were kept for years. Others were discarded when they aged out of desirability, sometimes as young as 16. Those no longer seen as attractive were sold, reassigned to hard labor, or quietly killed. Age, once a measure of value, became a liability. Many boys developed survival strategies: forced cheerfulness, mechanical obedience, emotional dissociation. Roman sources describe them with disturbing nonchalance. Boys who stopped speaking, who smiled at pain, who flinched at kindness. One Roman philosopher noted a concubine who spoke only in rehearsed phrases, comparing him to a trained parrot. He meant it as praise, proof of successful training. Isolation was absolute. Boys were forbidden from speaking to household staff or each other in any meaningful way. Friendships were considered dangerous, potential seeds of rebellion. Even eye contact with outsiders was discouraged. Anything that could remind them of life beyond their role was cut off. Every part of their being was controlled: clothing, meals, language, posture. Even silence had rules. Some masters required their concubines to recite poetry or sing during meals. Others expected complete quiet unless spoken to. Education, if offered, served the master's vanity. Music lessons, recitations of Virgil, or even philosophical debates were designed to make the boy a more cultured accessory. Knowledge wasn't empowerment, it was entertainment. Even medicine was utilitarian. Physicians treated infections and injuries that threatened the boy's aesthetic value, but ignored chronic pain, psychological collapse, or signs of trauma. The goal wasn't healing, it was maintenance. The few who outlived their use often carried scars, physical and invisible, for the rest of their lives. Some became assistants to slave traders, others turned to begging. A rare few gained freedom, but with no identity, no education, and no family, many disappeared into Rome's underclass. The system was precise, efficient, cruel. It didn't rely on secrecy, but on society's approval. And in Rome, no one powerful enough to stop it saw any reason to try. The emotional toll on Rome's concubines was devastating, not only because of the physical abuse, but because they were denied even the dignity of suffering. Their pain was invisible by design. Contemporary Roman writings occasionally reference these boys, but rarely as individuals. They were anonymous, aesthetic, disposable. When a philosopher or poet mentioned a concubine who ceased to speak, or tore at his skin in silence, it was framed not as tragedy, but as background. Decorations to elite narratives. Many boys developed symptoms we would now recognize as PTSD, chronic fear, disassociation, depression. Some stopped speaking entirely, others mutilated themselves in secret, not to end life, but to assert some small control over their own body, to bleed on their terms. There were concubines who would fake illness to avoid service, knowing the punishment could be severe. Some attempted escape, but few succeeded. Those who did were marked by scars, brands, or memory. Once enslaved for this purpose, there was no return to normal life. Medical care focused only on what could be seen. Bruises were concealed, infections treated, smiles forced. Household physicians might be called to treat a rash, but not a breakdown. One source mentions a concubine who lost the ability to recognize his own name. The owner had him sold, complaining he had gone dull. And still, the system thrived. Because Rome didn't view these children as victims. It saw them as status, luxuries to be collected, flaunted, discarded. Elite men competed over who had the most beautiful, the most talented, the most exotic boys. They traded stories at banquets, wrote letters describing how well-trained a child had become. Owning a concubine was not a secret vice, it was public prestige. And this normalization, more than any one crime, made the practice unstoppable. Slave markets advertised concubines openly. Contracts specified intimate use. Auctioneers knew what buyers wanted and how much they'd pay. Boys were posed, paraded, assessed, not for workability, but for submission. Every detail was calculated to erase resistance. From isolation to sleep deprivation to orchestrated dependence on the abuser, the system mirrored what modern psychology identifies as coercive control. But in Rome, it was not considered abuse. It was considered civilization. This wasn't a hidden chapter in history. It was an open pillar of Roman society, ignored not out of ignorance, but out of convenience. Rome's legal system allowed it, its elite encouraged it, its economy profited from it.